The order sounded almost like a myth. Bring Eichmann, dead or alive. But in 1959, for 3 men sitting in a dimly lit room in Tel Aviv, it wasn't a legend. It was the beginning of the most dangerous hunt of their lives. Outside, the city was falling asleep. Inside, someone slid a grainy photograph across the table. A bald man in round glasses, blending into a crowd in Buenos Aires. Find him, the director said quietly, and whatever happens, don't come back without him. The hunt began with a whisper, a rumor from a German immigrant in Argentina. He claimed his daughter's boyfriend had a strange father, a man who never spoke about the war, a man who avoided cameras, a man with the surname Clement. The agents studied the name. Clement, a harmless word, a common word. But sometimes monsters hide behind the simplest masks. One of the agents leaned forward. "What if he's still alive?" he asked. The answer came like a cold gust of wind. "Then he's waiting for us." When the team landed in Buenos Aires, it felt like stepping into enemy territory. Argentina was full of ghosts, former SS officers, collaborators, sympathizers. A perfect place for a man like Eichmann to disappear. The agents split up, pretending to be businessmen, tourists, even teachers. Every evening they gathered in a cramped apartment with peeling paint, sharing scraps of information. One evening, a young operative placed a notebook on the table. "I followed the girl," he said, "the daughter of the man calling himself Clement." Everyone leaned in. She walks home to a small house on Garibaldi Street, and a man steps out to greet her. He paused, letting the silence tighten. No photographs, no documents, but his voice, it matches the survivor testimonies exactly. The agents knew the hardest part was still ahead. Identifying Eichmann was one thing. Capturing him was another entirely. Buenos Aires was a city of shadows, where neighbors never asked questions, and the walls had ears. Every move had to be invisible. For weeks, they trailed him from a distance, always careful not to be seen. Eichmann, or Clement as he now called himself, lived a quiet life, almost painfully ordinary. He took the bus to work, bought groceries at the same store, always wore the same ill-fitting suits. It was hard to believe that the architect of millions of deaths could blend so perfectly into mundane life. At night, the team huddled in their tiny apartment, drawing maps of the neighborhood, noting every patrol, every potential witness. They took turns sleeping, eating, and observing. Sometimes frustration gnawed at them. A single misstep could ruin months of work. One operative, staring at the ceiling, muttered, "Is this the man who orchestrated the trains, the ghettos, the camps?" Another answered quietly, almost to himself, "Yes." And now he thinks he is safe. It was a surreal tension, a mixture of fear, anticipation, and a creeping dread that the city itself might be conspiring against them. Every honk of a car, every bark of a dog made hearts skip, and yet none could deny a growing certainty. They were closing in. Then came the day that changed everything. The daughter of Clement had a party. It was a small gathering in her backyard, lights strung across the fence, music faintly echoing down the street. And there he was, stepping outside, laughing politely, seemingly unaware of the eyes tracking his every move. One of the agents whispered, "This is our chance. We cannot wait any longer." But even as they prepared, the thought lingered. What if he recognized them? What if the hunt had already ended before it had truly begun? It was the calm before a storm no one could fully predict. The plan was simple on paper, but deadly in execution. They would wait until Eichmann left the party and follow him to a secluded spot. From there, they would abduct him, blindfold him, and smuggle him out of Argentina. No questions asked. They rented a small van under a false company name, loaded it with crates to hide a human body, and waited in the shadows. Every hour felt like a year. Every passerby was a potential threat. Finally, the moment came. Eichmann stepped off the porch, adjusting his hat, humming softly. The agents moved silently, blending with the night, hearts pounding. One misstep and the entire operation could explode into disaster. They reached the alley and the lead agent tapped the side of the van, the signal. Eichmann froze for a heartbeat, then instinctively turned. But before he could react, two men grabbed him, muffled his protest, and shoved him into the vehicle. The city seemed to hold its breath as the van slid away into darkness. Inside, Eichmann's eyes darted around. He was no longer the ordinary man from the streets of Buenos Aires. He was the hunted. And the realization hit him with cold clarity. This was no random attack. These were men with a single purpose: justice, by any means necessary. For the agents, the ride was tense silence, broken only by the occasional sound of tires on asphalt. Every stoplight, every shadow, seemed like a potential trap. And yet, there was a grim satisfaction in knowing that, after years of evasion, they had finally caught the man who had once thought himself untouchable. But even as the van disappeared into the night, a question hung over them. How would they get him out of Argentina without anyone noticing? The answer would require cunning, courage, and a gamble that could cost them everything. They hid Eichmann in a safe house on the outskirts of Buenos Aires, a decaying building with cracked walls and broken shutters that rattled in the wind. Inside, a single chair stood in the center of a bare room. They sat him down, tied his hands, and removed the blindfold. For a moment, no one spoke. Eichmann blinked against the dim light, trying to focus. His face was pale, almost wax-like. He looked nothing like the cold officer from wartime photographs. Yet something in his eyes, a sharp, calculating glint, had not changed. "Your name?" the lead agent asked. "Ricardo Clement," Eichmann replied, voice trembling just enough to seem rehearsed. The agent leaned in, holding a stack of documents, testimonies, orders, signatures. He placed one sheet in front of him. "This," he said quietly, "was signed by Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible for the deportation of millions. Look closely. It's your handwriting." Eichmann's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The room felt colder. They interrogated him for hours, never raising their voices. Every question was precise, calculated. Eichmann tried to deny, to deflect, to protect the last shreds of the life he had built. But cracks began to show. Small slips, familiar phrases, technical terms only one man could know. Finally, exhausted, cornered, stripped of all illusions, Eichmann whispered the words the team had been waiting for. "I will cooperate." But confessing was only the beginning. Now, the agents faced a greater challenge: smuggling the most wanted Nazi criminal on Earth out of a country filled with people who would gladly kill to protect him. And time was running out. The night outside was thick with fog, masking their movements, yet the streets were alive with danger. Argentina had many who would have killed to protect Clement: former Nazis, sympathizers, corrupt officials. One wrong turn, one inattentive guard, and the entire operation could collapse. The agents devised a plan so audacious, it seemed almost impossible. Eichmann would not leave Argentina as himself. They created a new identity. A technician traveling for a company, needing urgent repairs in Europe. Every detail had to be perfect. Passports, visas, uniforms, even mannerisms. Eichmann resisted at first. The agents noticed his defiance, the flicker of arrogance that once enabled him to orchestrate mass murder. "I am not a criminal," he insisted, voice steady but eyes darting nervously. "You are a man who hid behind false names for years," the lead agent replied evenly. "Tonight, we decide if justice finds you." They trained him in silence, correcting the smallest gesture, the way he held documents, the way he spoke Spanish and German, until he could pass as someone entirely new. Then came the most dangerous part, getting him to the airport. They loaded Eichmann into a nondescript vehicle. 2 agents drove. 1 followed in a car behind. Each red light, each patrol car passing by, tightened the knot of fear in their chests. Eichmann remained silent, staring at the ceiling, but the team could feel the tension emanating from him. At the airport, the agents knew every step counted. 1 misread signal from the officials, 1 minor slip, and Eichmann would be free again, or worse, dead in their hands, leaving no proof, no justice. As they handed him over to the first checkpoint under his false identity, the lead agent whispered, "Every second from now is a gamble, and we can't afford to lose." Even now, as the planes roared above the runway, a part of them wondered if they had truly outsmarted a man who had once survived a world at war. The flight to Israel was tense beyond description. Eichmann sat between 2 agents, his hands bound but his mind clearly racing. Outside the small airplane windows, the night sky stretched endlessly, indifferent to the struggle unfolding within the cabin. Every bump in the air made the agents flinch. Every distant light from below seemed like it could expose them. They spoke in whispers, reviewing every contingency: bribes, checkpoints, customs inspections. Eichmann remained silent, occasionally glancing at the documents he had been forced to carry. Papers that detailed his new identity, travel orders, and false business credentials. Hours passed like days. The tension was suffocating. The lead agent, who had planned every detail of the operation, could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. This was no ordinary prisoner transport. This was the culmination of a decade-long hunt, the capture of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. Eichmann finally spoke, almost casually, breaking the heavy silence. "You believe you've caught justice, but justice is only what men decide it is." The agents didn't answer. Words could not undo the horrors of the past, nor could they erase the meticulous planning that had brought them to this moment. Hours later, the plane touched down in Israel under the cover of night. Agents had secured a clandestine landing site, away from prying eyes. Every step out of the aircraft was choreographed, every shadow accounted for. The man they had captured, the architect of mass murder, was now walking on soil where the memory of his crimes weighed heavily. For the first time, Eichmann's mask began to crack. Fear replaced arrogance. Hesitation replaced confidence. And for the agents, a grim satisfaction mingled with the knowledge that the most dangerous phase of their mission was still ahead, bringing him to trial, facing the world, and ensuring that history would remember. The city outside was quiet, oblivious to the secret arrival that would soon make headlines across the globe. The safe house in Israel was stark, almost sterile, chosen deliberately to prevent leaks and witnesses. Eichmann was isolated, allowed minimal contact with the outside world. Every visitor was vetted, every word monitored. Even the agents guarding him felt the oppressive weight of history pressing down. Eichmann, once so commanding, now seemed smaller in this confined space. He prowled the room like a caged animal, glancing at the walls as if searching for an escape. But escape was no longer an option. The walls were final, the silence absolute. During the nights, the agents pored over files, testimonies, and documents that would later form the backbone of the trial. They discussed Eichmann's meticulous records of deportations, the bureaucratic precision of his orders, the horrifying efficiency that allowed millions to perish. In moments of quiet, one of the younger agents dared to speak to Eichmann. "Did you ever imagine someone would follow you for 10 years? Eichmann's reply was chilling in its calmness. "Men forget, or they pretend to, but some never forget. Perhaps that is justice." Despite his words, a flicker of fear lingered in his eyes. The reality was sinking in, that he would no longer hide behind bureaucracy, no longer rely on the world's indifference. Soon every action, every decision, every signature would be examined. Every lie, every excuse would be laid bare. The agents knew the world would soon watch Eichmann under a microscope. And as the hours passed, they also knew that the man they had hunted across continents, through shadows and lies, was about to face something far more formidable than any agent or operation: the judgment of history itself. And yet, one question haunted them all. Would he show remorse, or would he remain the same calculating bureaucrat who orchestrated one of the greatest horrors in human history? The trial was set. For months, lawyers, historians, and survivors prepared. Every testimony, every document, every photograph was a piece of a vast, horrifying puzzle. Eichmann would no longer hide behind false names or bureaucratic euphemisms. The world was about to see him, not as Clement, not as an ordinary man, but as Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible for orchestrating the deaths of millions. On the first day, the courtroom was electric with tension. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and survivors sat rigid, clutching their papers as if the weight of memory might crush them. Eichmann entered, tall, thin, his face eerily calm, as if he were stepping into an ordinary office rather than the center of global scrutiny. He sat, folding his hands neatly, glancing around with a detached precision. When asked to state his name, he obeyed without hesitation: Adolf Eichmann. The prosecution began, detailing his movements across Europe during the war: the ghettos, the trains, the camps. Witnesses spoke of deportations, of endless columns of people herded to death. Each account was precise, harrowing, unflinching. Eichmann listened, occasionally scribbling notes, his face betraying almost nothing. But as testimonies piled up, a strange pattern emerged. Where once he had been a figure of bureaucratic invisibility, he now became undeniably human and disturbingly ordinary. His defense lawyers argued he was just following orders, trying to frame him as a cog in a massive machine. Yet the courtroom felt suffocatingly silent each time a survivor recounted the reality of his decisions. Eichmann's composure began to falter in small ways. A twitch, a hesitation, a sudden glance that seemed to search for allies in the crowd. It was clear even to the coldest observers. The man who had evaded justice for over a decade was now exposed, cornered and powerless. And the world watched, holding its collective breath, as history began to answer the question that had haunted the hunt from the start. Could a single man, a bureaucrat in uniform, be held accountable for the horror he engineered? Days turned into weeks. Each morning, the courtroom filled with murmurs as new witnesses recounted horrors so vivid that even hardened journalists shivered. Survivors described entire families torn apart, towns emptied, lives erased. And through it all, Eichmann sat, sometimes taking notes, sometimes staring blankly, occasionally muttering phrases that betrayed the faintest cracks in his composure. The prosecution had a strategy to show the world the human face behind the bureaucracy of death. Every train schedule he signed, every deportation order he approved, every report he filed became evidence of his personal responsibility. The argument was unrelenting. Eichmann had choices, and he made them. During a particularly intense session, a survivor described the moment her parents were taken. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned with fury and memory. Eichmann shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The court observed a tension almost unbearable, the dissonance between the man's calm demeanor and the terror his actions had caused. Observers whispered among themselves, "Is this arrogance, denial, or simply a man who has become numb to humanity?" Outside the courtroom, protests raged. People demanded justice. Others debated the morality of trying a man decades after his crimes. But inside, one undeniable fact remained. For the first time in years, Eichmann could not escape. Every lie, every evasion, every attempt at invisibility had been stripped away. The lead investigator, watching from the back of the courtroom, whispered to a colleague, "We hunted him across continents, through shadows, and now the world will judge him, not us." And Eichmann, finally, had nowhere left to hide. As the trial progressed, Eichmann's defences grew more desperate. He insisted repeatedly that he was just a small part of a larger machine, that he had no personal animosity, that obedience was his duty. Yet the courtroom was unmoved. Each document, each witness dismantled his narrative piece by piece. One day, a former colleague took the stand. He spoke not just of orders, but of letters, memorandums, and personal meetings where Eichmann had directed operations with precision, the same precision that had sent millions to their deaths. The man's words were calm, almost clinical, yet every phrase struck like a hammer. Eichmann's face, usually composed, betrayed a flicker of unease. A small tremor ran through his hands. The mask of detachment was slipping. Even his lawyers exchanged worried glances. Outside, journalists described the spectacle. A man who once seemed untouchable, now reduced to explaining his actions to strangers who could see through every excuse. Historians analysed every statement, dissected every order, turning bureaucratic minutiae into proof of moral responsibility. One evening, the lead investigator reflected on the journey that had brought Eichmann here. From the shadows of Buenos Aires, through secret safe houses, to a courtroom watched by the world. The hunt had been long, dangerous, and relentless. Yet nothing compared to the intensity of seeing him finally confronted with the consequences of his choices. In the courtroom, Eichmann spoke again. "I did what I was ordered to do. I was following the law." A survivor rose to respond. Her voice was steady, piercing. "The law you followed murdered millions. That is not duty. That is choice." Silence fell. Even Eichmann paused, the weight of the statement settling in the air. And now, the trial was no longer just about documents or orders. It was about truth, morality, and the inescapable judgment of history. As the weeks wore on, Eichmann's defenses became almost ritualistic. He repeated the same lines, the same excuses, the same arguments about obedience and duty. But the prosecution had anticipated every word. Every attempt at deflection was met with evidence. Letters, signed orders, travel logs, testimonies from survivors. Each piece of proof reinforced the undeniable fact Eichmann had acted with knowledge and intent. During a particularly tense session, a survivor recounted the selection process at a concentration camp. She described how men, women, and children were separated, how families were torn apart in moments. Eichmann listened silently, occasionally scribbling notes, but the room could feel a subtle shift. Something in him, perhaps fear, perhaps realization, was beginning to surface. The lead investigator, sitting at the back of the courtroom, observed closely. Every twitch, every hesitation, every micro-expression mattered. The man they had hunted for years, the architect of one of history's darkest chapters, was finally confronting the human consequences of his actions in real time. The prosecution moved to close the case. They laid out the evidence methodically, showing how Eichmann's decisions had directly contributed to the deaths of millions. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional gasp. Even Eichmann's lawyers struggled to respond. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The question of personal responsibility. Eichmann was asked directly if he acknowledged the human suffering caused by his orders. He paused, eyes narrowing, as if weighing every possible word. The silence stretched. Outside, the world waited. Inside, history held its breath. And finally, his answer, simple, chilling, yet revealing more than he intended, would set the stage for the verdict that was to follow. Eichmann's voice finally broke the silence. "I was following orders," he said, almost mechanically. But the courtroom was no longer listening to a man pleading innocence. They were witnessing a man stripped bare, confronted by the magnitude of his actions. Every survivor, every historian, every journalist in that room knew the truth. Obedience was no excuse, and bureaucracy could not hide responsibility. The judges reviewed the evidence, weighing decades of meticulous documentation, testimonies of unspeakable suffering, and Eichmann's own words. The atmosphere was heavy, the tension almost unbearable. Outside, people gathered in the streets, following news updates, anxious for justice to be delivered. Eichmann, once the hunter of Jews across Europe, now sat quietly, handcuffed, stripped of pretense. For the first time in decades, he was powerless. He tried to compose himself, but the eyes of survivors and the weight of history pressed upon him like an invisible chain. The lead investigator watched from the gallery, thinking back to Buenos Aires, the months of tracking, the nights of surveillance, the risk of discovery. Every step, every decision had led to this moment. They had captured him, smuggled him across continents, and now the world would finally see the man behind the crimes. And in that courtroom, with history as witness, it became clear. This was not just a trial of one man. It was a reckoning, a confrontation with the darkest parts of humanity. Eichmann's fate was now in the hands of those who represented justice itself, and the world waited for the final word. The verdict was pronounced. Eichmann was found guilty on multiple counts: crimes against humanity, war crimes, and complicity in the deaths of millions. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, the weight of decades of horror finally being acknowledged and confronted. Eichmann listened, his face pale but expressionless, as the judges detailed the reasoning behind their decision. There was no evasion, no doubt, no ambiguity. Every order he had signed, every train he had organized, every life extinguished under his oversight was accounted for. The meticulous bureaucracy that had allowed him to hide for years could not protect him from accountability. Outside, survivors wept quietly, some clutching photographs of lost family members, others standing in silent relief. Journalists captured the moment for the world to witness. The capture, the trial, the judgment. A man who had believed himself untouchable had been brought to heel, not by myth or rumor, but by determination, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice. For the agents who had hunted him through shadows and continents, there was a profound sense of closure. Their months of danger, their years of planning, had culminated in this moment. Eichmann had been caught, smuggled, and confronted with the truth. And now the world had witnessed it too. In the end, the story was not just about one man, but about the unyielding reach of justice. Eichmann had thought he could escape, hide, and vanish into the ordinary. But no darkness lasts forever. Even a decade of evasion could not shield him from accountability. And as the courtroom emptied, one thought lingered in the minds of those who had pursued him. Sometimes justice requires patience, courage, and a willingness to follow a shadow across the world, until even the most cunning can no longer hide. The hunt was over. Eichmann was dead or alive, but justice had found him.